I'm Sharon R. Chickering, Esquire, and the date is May 10, 2023. We're interviewing Angelica Didier Light, one of the first women attorneys to practice in the Roanoke Valley of Virginia. This interview is part of the Oral History Project of the Virginia Women Attorneys Association, Roanoke chapter, interviewing the first women attorneys to practice in the 23rd Judicial Circuit of the Commonwealth of Virginia. The interview today is being recorded at the Charlottesville, Virginia home of Angelica Light, and the videographer is Melissa Stevens. Angelica, do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes, you do.
All right. Could you tell us a little bit about your childhood, when you were born, where, names of your family, and just a little bit about growing up?
I was born Angelica Preston Didier actually in Paris, Kentucky, but at 2 weeks old I was moved up to Maumee, Ohio, where I was raised. My parents were both from the South, but followed my grandfather up there, who offered my father a job after he returned from the war, World War II. I have had two brothers, an older brother, Darcy, and a younger brother, Joe. My father worked in his father's cannery for several years before becoming a salesman in Toledo, Ohio. And my mother got her master's of teaching so that she could actually teach at a private school where my grandmother was sending my older brother, but there wasn't enough money to send all of us, so she got a job there and was able to get free tuition. So we had a wonderful private school education in Toledo. We had a headmaster who had gone to school at Williams College. He was bound and determined to send his brighter children out of Ohio to the east, and so I and two others of my classmates went to Smith College in 1967.
So tell us a little bit about your educational background and your college experience.
Well, I loved being at Smith. It was very exciting. It was a brand new world. I'll have to tell you about the first morning when I came down to breakfast in my dormitory called a house. One of my new classmates was sitting at the table, and she was reading the New York Times. And I said, "Good morning." And her first words were, "What do you think about this abortion business?" And I said to myself, "I'm not in Ohio anymore. This is very different." And it was very different. It was a wonderful growing experience. And while I was there from 67 to 71 was the height of the Vietnam War protests. And there were some very exciting things that happened for me and to me during those years.
So if I understand correctly, you were involved in some protests?
Well, that's true. We really all were, and I think that generation became highly politicized because of it. One of the things that I had been involved in was the local Episcopal youth group, and through that group I met a bishop from South Africa, an Episcopal bishop who had been thrown out of South Africa because he had given communion to both blacks and whites. Wow. And he was living in California, but he was doing a special retreat for the Princeton and Smith youth groups at a Seabury house in Connecticut. So he and I met there, had interesting conversations, and in the fall of '69, he called our chaplain there at Smith College and said, "Find Angelica and ask her if she wants to be an aide. I'm going to the big march in Washington in November."
And what's the big march?
The big march was the March on Washington to protest the war. It was the big moratorium march. And I went, and we were with the celebrity brigade of protesters, and that included songwriters, Arlo Guthrie, and let's see, who else was there? We had just a whole panoply. Oh, we had Dr. Spock, we had Harvey Cox, who was a theologian at Harvard. We had Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Oh, wow.
They were all in a great assemblage, and we were walking at the beginning, at the head of the march, and we were surrounded by a ring of dark-suited men. Oh, wow. And they actually were almost holding their hands around us.
Oh, wow.
And they all had little lapel pins, And we had no idea who they were. And later we simply surmised that they were part of the FBI or Secret Service or some organization like that of the federal government to ensure that these high-profile protesters didn't get harmed, perhaps either by the other protesters or by the police. So we got to the Washington Monument, which was the place we were headed, and we sat in the grandstand, and the opening words came from, well, after Mrs. King spoke and started the assemblage, and there were about 500,000 people gathered there at the monument. The next person up was Dr. Benjamin Spock, who was the great pediatrician and writer who had produced the baby book for the post-war parents. And he started his remarks with, "My children." And of course we all were. We had been raised according to his suggestions and advice, and I think our parents were ruining that advice that they had taken, because my father was adamant about objecting to my being involved in the protest. I mean, he was just afraid for my safety, but he also said, "I'm a Marine, that's un-American to do that." And, but we finally reconciled on that, especially after my brother was subject to the draft and had to go in.
That was Darcy?
Yes.
Yes. So tell me a little bit about Smith College in terms of what kind of college is that?
It's an all-women's college, about 2,500 women. It was part of the original Seven Sisters that include Vassar and Wellesley and Bryn Mawr and the other fine women's colleges that sprang up early on in the late 1800s to educate young women, and in the face of the fact that they were not permitted to the men's Ivy League colleges. They weren't admitted. So the women's colleges were formed, mostly there in the East, and it was a place of, it was really liberating to be on a campus with just all women. You know, you didn't have to worry what you looked like. You weren't jockeying for position in class to sit next to so-and-so. It was just it was a very freeing moment. And our president then was the son of a smithy. Okay. And he said, "This is where you are first-class citizens, and don't you ever forget it when you go out into the world." And it was a place that really, you know, gave us backbone.
Very
and
nice.
Helped us surmount some of those barriers that we as young women in the 70s faced as we were heading off into careers.
So what time frame were you at Smith?
I was there from 67 to 71.
Okay. And if I understand correctly, that was around the time that the Kent State shooting occurred?
Now, that happened in 1970, so it was after the march. It was in, actually, I looked it up, it was May 4th.
Oh, wow. So a month?
So 53 years ago.
Wow.
Last week. And it was, I was sitting in the student cafeteria over at the University of Massachusetts, because we could take classes at any of the 5 colleges in the Connecticut Valley. And up on the big television jumbo screen was the news clip of the shootings at Kent State and the death of the 4 students and the wounding of 7 others. And it was galvanizing for all the students in the area. That next day, we gathered at J.M. Green Hall on the Smith campus to try to figure out what we were going to do. And a fellow from Amherst College jumped up on the stage and said, "Here's what we're going to do." And we basically said, "Someone get the hook and get that guy off the stage." So we then planned our response, and much of the unrest at that point was due to the bombing of in Cambodia,
right,
where Nixon had decided he needed to take out what he considered to be the staging grounds for the communists in Vietnam. And so we decided that we would stage a strike, and we did. That was the spring of my junior year. We went to sit-ins, we had seminars, we did not go to class. And my father, who was very upset about this, he and my mother flew out from Ohio to have a conversation with me about all of this. And they were paying good money, and Mother was still
Sure.
working in order to pay that tuition. And he was not convinced by my arguments, but fortunately we were going to be permitted to take our exams in the fall when we returned. So I wasn't losing a semester as a result of the strike. And his comment to me finally was, you know, I sent you to college to get an education and not all these wild, crazy ideas. And I truly thought for years I should have sent that into campus humor for the Reader's
Yes.
Digest.
Yes. Oh, wow. So you went from Smith where?
To Washington and Lee. Well, first I had an interim. I did not realize that I wanted to go to law school until my senior year, and I was taking con law courses both at Smith and over at Amherst. And I was just fascinated. I was on fire. I thought it was the most interesting thing ever. And I was a history major, but that played into it in a way, because the Constitution is something that
Yes.
really comes from history.
Yes.
And has a history all of its own in terms of its interpretation. So I decided I was going to come back to Northampton after the summer, and I worked as a waitress at the local Hilton and learned how to read the horse racing sheet. It was quite an education.
I bet.
Then in November went on to Boston, where I had worked as a nanny the summer before. Stayed with that family in the suburbs of Boston and worked at a law firm, Nutter, McLennan and Fish, a very old line law firm. And I worked for a wonderful attorney by the name of Florence Lindy. And Florence Lindy was Jewish and female, and she was given the estates department to handle. So when the estate matters were to be settled, she handled that. We typed up all the inventories of all the property in those estates. And of course, at that point, you didn't have corrector tape. You started over if you made a mistake. And I realized two things. Actually, she helped me realize two things. That one, I couldn't type, and two, that I was underemployed. And I realized when I went to sit in for work as a secretary for one of the young associates, he was a mess. I don't know how he got hired in the first place. I said, God, I can do this. So I, at that point, had applied to law school, or was in the course of it, and applied to W&L simply because my father sent me an excerpt from his alumni magazine that said the law school was going to start admitting women.
So your father went to W&L as well.
He did, and my grandfather taught there. In fact, that's how my father had met my mother. She was a year ahead of him. She had skipped 8th grade because nobody in Lexington, Virginia ever went to 8th grade. So she was there around on the campus. He started dating her. He was a great football player, and that's kind of why he had gone there. They said, bring your track shoes. And he was having trouble with Latin. So she agreed to tutor him, and they fell in love. And 6 months into their dating, they found out they had been born on the same day.
Oh my goodness!
So it was fate.
That's
and,
great.
They were always a lovely couple and great parents, but from another era.
Sure.
But interestingly enough, I've always known that my mother had real ambition, and she was glad to have me out there living out that ambition for her.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. So you do have a connection to Botetourt County, is that correct?
Well, that too. My on my father's side, he is of the Preston clan. There was William Preston, who came over as a Scotch-Irish immigrant in the mid-1700s, and he traveled down the valley from the Stanton area on down to the Roanoke area, the Roanoke Valley. He ended up at Fincastle.
Okay.
Built a home there, which was basically a fort. It was attacked a few times by Indians. And my father always found lots and lots of arrowheads in the fields around Greenfield.
Wow.
Then William Preston moved on down to Blacksburg, where he built the home Smithfield, which is a historic site now. But it was a big family. A lot of them participated in the early days in Virginia government. And at one point, my son, who was a law student at the time, clerking in the summer, was sitting in the legislative. I guess he was in the House of Delegates section of the of the buildings there in Richmond. And he saw a portrait in a back room of a Preston. He said, is he one of ours? I said, I think so. They all were. But that large family, my grandmother was one of 10 children there in
Wow.
Fincastle, and so there were lots of cousins around for my father, and lots of cousins around for me. He had 17 first cousins. I have 36 second cousins from that group. And I
Wow.
have three of those families living here in Charlottesville.
Wow. So how did you find out that you gotten into WNL?
Oh, well, that was kind of fun. I had applied. I hoped I'd get in. My law boards weren't that great. The grades were fine, but somehow, and I should have known this, thinking back on it, my law boards were fine, but not spectacular. WNL was probably the only place I was going to get in. And I got in because they were really looking for women. And interestingly enough, I think they were looking for sort of safe women.
Mm-hmm.
All of us had parents or grandparents who had gone to WNL.
Okay.
And with my grandmother living there in Lexington and playing bridge with the secretary of the law school, and the secretary of the law school was kind of in charge of putting the applications in this pile or that pile before sending them into the dean, I was pretty well assured that I would have a place. And I thrived. I really enjoyed law school. It was, we had a wonderful class of guys, both the first year class and my brother's class a year ahead of me were filled with veterans from service in the Vietnam War.
Do you think that made a difference?
It did. They were mature. Many were married. My brother's class, many of them were married. And they were serious about getting their degrees. And so there wasn't a whole lot of playing around. The wives were out working, teaching in the schools around Rockbridge County under miserable conditions. And sometimes when I would see some of those guys sitting in the lounge reading Field and Stream, I'd say, you need to be going home to your wife and that child. Oh my gosh, it was a wonderful story. Lexington's a lovely small town, and one day I was at the corner, just enjoying some conversation with classmates. I'm walking back to the law school that was still on the front part of the campus at that point, and a woman came in with a small child in hand, said, does anyone know this child? I found him wandering on the campus. Couldn't have been more than 3.5 or 4. I said, oh yes, that's a law student's child. So I took the child and walked him down the colonnade and up the stairs, because I knew that the fellow was in my brother's class, and they were in con law at the moment. So we went to the 3rd floor, and I knocked on the door, opened it up, and I said, Michael, I think you are missing something. And of course, everyone said, whoa, what is this woman doing carrying a child? This is what she's good for. You know, it was all that kind of reaction. But it was a funny situation, because I've always loved small children. And I've been blessed to have 2 of my own, and now, 9 grandchildren.
Wow.
So it was a special sort of realization on my part. Yes, I love law school, but I also really wanted a family.
So at that time, WNL, the undergraduate school was still not co-ed, it was all
Correct.
male. And the law school was, it was 1972, that first year that you...
That's correct.
And that was the year that it became co-ed. Do you know what happened, why they became co-ed?
Oh, that's another good story. It seems that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was assigned to serve on the ABA's school committee on women in the law.
Okay.
Women in law schools, actually. It was related to the schools. And they had an anti-discrimination policy that was in effect. It was race and religion and place of origin. Those are the 3 criteria. And she said, of course, why not sex?
Right.
Which was always her podium. And so they adopted that. And as soon as they adopted, because she had found out that there was a law school that didn't admit women, and she was just appalled. And so they all agreed to put sex into the requirement. The ABA approved it, and our dean had been pushing for it. He had come from the University of Michigan, and he said that's the only way we can become a leading law school. And so most of the faculty was in favor of it. There were some older gentlemen who were not keen on it. They had always been at W&L in an all-male environment. But the president of the university thought it was really fabulous. And of course, they had to do it because otherwise they were going to lose their accreditation. So I was a beneficiary of that, as were the other 5 women in my class.
So did you see it as a real transition to go from an all-women to almost all-male institution?
Oh, it's funny. I never really saw it in those terms. I enjoyed being in the all-female environment, and I had plenty of guy friends all the way through high school, and having guy friends in my class at law school was fine. I didn't see a real problem. The interesting point was that we had to keep helping the older faculty members not use our restroom. We had been given the men's faculty restroom, which of course had its urinals in it.
Oh,
and
yes.
so when we got the bathroom, we put in cherry, those little, well, they were little cherry tomato plants or something they had put in there, decorative. They died. But we got CVL and we got Professor Light to not come in, and we all survived. It was a small building, and there were 72 in my class, and the same in the other classes. So we were all kind of shoulder to shoulder in that building. And fortunately, after I graduated, they had a new building to move into.
So you were one of 6 women in that class?
That's right. There was a 7th who started that year, and she had been hired as the assistant law librarian. She had a library degree, but she needed her law degree in order to become a head law librarian. And so Sally Wyant started with us, and she received her degree a year after we did, and became the head librarian when her predecessor retired, and was there for over 30 years.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Okay. So during that time, did you do any internships or anything like that?
Yes, every summer you needed a clerkship to get your feet wet, and I was fortunate enough to know a fellow in Toledo through my father's social circle, and he was the head of Dana Corporation. So I got a clerkship there in their law department, and that was a great experience. I got to do a little traveling to Washington. I was dealing with some of the regulatory matters that impacted the automotive supply industry, and that's where I was working. That was great. The next year, my second year, I was participating as a witness in a trial practice course. And in the course of that, a third yearman, Kurt Steele, in my brother's class, interviewed me as part of the trial practice. And after I played my part, he was telling me about his clerkship at Norfolk and Western Railway down in Roanoke. And I said, well, that sounds interesting, because I at that point had already figured that I was probably best suited for a corporate practice. I had enjoyed that first summer, arriving at 9 and leaving at 5. And I said, this could be a nice way to live. And so I did. I applied for the job. Actually, I think I may have been recruited to a certain extent, because I think Kurt let the general counsel at NOW know that I was interested in corporate work. That gentleman was named Martin Burks, and Martin Burks had a very outspoken wife and 3 outspoken daughters. And I think he knew it was really time that the railroad got with the program and hired a woman, more women executives, and he was best placed to get a woman lawyer. And so I went down, interviewed for the job, and it was an interesting interview. He said, now, Angelica, I think I know your great aunt Susan. And I said, there at Fincastle? He said, yes. He said, I used to spend the most wonderful summer afternoons sitting on the porch, chatting with her and her brothers and sisters, and we had high times there at the house at Greenfield in Botetourt County. And I said to myself, I think this is going pretty well. And sure enough, 30 minutes later, after some chit-chat. I had written a law review article. We talked a little bit about that. He called in the vice president of law, Jack Shannon, and they offered me the job, the clerkship. And I was so excited that I was actually going to be earning some real money that I went to Tanglewood Mall and bought a new pair of shoes. It was a great day.
So, did you feel that your gender affected your practice at the railroad in any way?
Not really. I was fortunate enough to be in the law department, which was highly respected at the railroad because the chief executives had always come out of the law department. And the lawyers always ran N&W. They came from the Pennsylvania Railroad, our predecessor. And it was a tradition that senior executives be lawyers. And so it was every operating decision, every corporate decision had to be approved by the law department. And to do that, the lawyers were always involved at the beginning of these projects to make sure that, one, they were smart business, because lawyers do have a lot of brains, and two, that they were ethical, and three, they were legal. And so it was really fun to be involved in projects proposed by the operating department. And the operating department is run like the military. I mean, those trains are supposed to run on time. And so it had sort of a crusty vice president of operations in charge of it, but all the employees under him were very accepting of me. In fact, I knew that I had really made it when I was talking to a superintendent out in West Virginia, and I suggested that we do this or we do that, and he said, "Yeah, ma'am." Yeah, ma'am. I've never forgotten. He was a lovely gentleman. And when during the course of my practice, I was often out in the field examining the railroad lines. We had a major program to divest or abandon these little used railroad lines that were costing us money and not earning as much income. So I had been asked to take on this project to get rid of about 2,200 miles of railroad line to trim us down, make us more profitable. And so I would go out with the superintendents who were in charge of those lines and some of their assistants, and we'd get on a high rail car, the ones that you drive, over the track and then you turn and get on the track.
Yes.
And I saw lots of cornfields, and it was really fun. It was fun to be out in the road, and I loved being with those operating guys. They were always respectful, always appreciative of the work that I was doing.
So tell us how that some of the rail abandonment project came out in Southwest Virginia.
Yes, I was charged with abandoning two of the lines out in far Southwest Virginia, and one of them is the Virginia Creeper line, and the project involved getting rid of a line that had two major trestles crossing the New River. And the challenge was, how could I take that wonderful scenic route and blend it into the Rails to Trails program that was being supported by the federal government at that point.
Wow.
And so I had to figure out how to get the operating department to come with me on this project to make it a Rails to Trails site. And I looked at the law and they said, there was a statute in Virginia that required utilities to remove their abandoned equipment when they were ceasing operations in a particular area. And I'm thinking, well, it was probably gas and electrical they were thinking of, but a railroad's a utility.
True.
So I told the operating department, I said, we're going to have to take those trestles out. They said, what do you mean? I said, we always leave them in place. Oh, there's a statute right here. It says you got to take them out. So, well, what about that Rails to Trails thing? Oh, I think that would probably work. It's always a good idea to make a man think
Sure.
thought first, right? And so we have a couple of wonderful trails down there. The one from Abington down to Damascus.
Is the Virginia Creeper?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
So at that time it was Norfolk and Western.
It was.
Okay. And was Roanoke the actual headquarters?
It was.
Okay.
It was. It was the only major railroad headquartered in a tiny town, relatively, to Chicago, to New York, to San Francisco.
Right, right.
And we were. It was a family operation almost. I mean, we all knew each other. We all lived in the same neighborhood, and it was very smartly run. Jack Fishwick was the CEO when I started, and he was a phenomenal. He was a fine lawyer.
He was.
And he expected all the rest of us to be, but he was a sharp businessman. In fact, the carpet in the law department offices was made from old Pullman car carpet.
Wow.
When we got rid of the Pullman cars, the carpet was saved and used in the law department. That's how tight Jack Fishwick was. And he, of course, we also owned the Hotel Roanoke. And
Yes.
That was where, the nicer things were. We didn't get the nice things. But it was such a well-run railroad that we had plenty of cash on hand, and we had some very nice salaries. They were higher than any of the other attorneys in Roanoke were making at the time. But at the time of the merger, it was with Southern Railway,
Okay.
another southeastern railway company. We had to merge because Chessie had merged as well with the Southern. What was the Southern Railroad?
So Chessie was Chesapeake and Ohio?
Yep, that
Okay.
was the Chesapeake and Ohio, and they merged with L&N and with Seaboard.
Okay.
And so they had merged, so we kind of did a defensive merger with Southern. And it was decided that the headquarters would not be in Washington, D.C., which is where Southern was headquartered, but in Norfolk. And we always thought that our CEO, Bob Clater at that point, had a daughter and 2 grandchildren in Norfolk and a sailboat up at Delta, Virginia, Deltaville. We said, maybe that's the reason. No, it's just even way between. We said, yeah, right,
Okay.
right, Bob. So we had we moved our headquarters. Well, the merger happened in 1980, and departments of N&W started moving down to Norfolk, and finally they took all of the law department in 1989. And at that point, I had to resign from the railroad.
So we'll get back to where you went next, but let's go back to when you first started to practice, and there were how many other women that you remember that were practicing law at that point when you first started at the railroad?
Well, there was only one other woman executive at the railroad, but at Women in Town, we had Diane Strickland and Ann Edenfield at Legal Aid, and I think Linda Steele came the next year, and Diane Perkinson. And there was one more that I recall who had been there for some time. She may have been, she wasn't in bankruptcy. That was Diane.
That was Diana Perkinson. Yeah.
There was another woman.
Okay.
But we were a small group.
Did y'all socialize? And,
Oh, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did. Especially Diane and Ann and Linda and I. And one day we were having lunch together at the Jefferson Club at the top of the bank building. And somebody saw us, and later Diane or Ann said, "You know what they're calling us now?" I said, "What?" "The Gang of Four." I said, "Really?" That was Mao's, top lieutenants in communist China, plotting all sorts of awful things. And they said, "Well, maybe that's what we thought we were doing." The fact that we would eat together must meant we were plotting something. Well, we would share stories. I mean, poor Diane was told she couldn't wear pantsuits at Wood's Rogers.
Wow.
I mean, really. And there were. I couldn't ride the inspection trains. The rather stuck in the mud vice president of operations said no women on the inspection trains. I don't know what they did on the inspection trains. I guess they drank a lot. Maybe I don't know what else they did. But anyway, I was not permitted to go on the inspection train. But that was the only, quote, discrimination I think I ever faced.
So there came a time when many of you started having children.
Yes.
So tell me about the joys and heartbreaks of trying to manage children and practice, and how you supported each other and your experiences.
Well, Diane was the first. She had the first baby, and we all kind of watched how she was balancing work and motherhood. And then I became pregnant, and in '81, and I said, I don't have a wardrobe for this. And so I had business up in Washington, and in Alexandria there's this wonderful fabric shop that had lots of men's suiting in it, because the tailors from Washington would come over there. And so I bought several yards of it, different checks and tweeds and whatnot, and took them back to my seamstress in Roanoke. And she did, from a Vogue pattern, which I always loved, a nice jumper and a short jacket. And it was perfect because you could expand as you needed to.
Yes.
And so I got through my winter pregnancy, and then Diane said, "Can I borrow them?" I said, "When do you due?" She said, "February." I said, "They're perfect." And so people had to sort of plan their babies around the wardrobe that went around town. I never did see it back again. We all managed. I nursed for 9 months, and fortunately, the headquarters for N&W were only 9 minutes from home in South Roanoke, and so I would go home every day at lunch and nurse. I tried very hard not to travel during that time. Part of my job did involve traveling, but I was able to limit that. And then my second child came along 3 years later. The first time I inquired, what's going to be the leave policy here? Well, they didn't have a leave policy for executive women because the other executive woman didn't have children. So the head of labor relations came upstairs, and he and Vice President of Law called me in and said, "Okay, here's what we can do for you. Fortunately, you worked here for 6 years so far, so you get 6 weeks paid time disability." I said, "Disability? It's just pregnancy."
Right.
Well, it's disability. Okay. And then after that, you can apply for railroad retirement benefits, which would take care of disability,
Wow.
railroad disability. So I said, "Okay, so how's that work?" "Well, you get 50% of your pay." And I said, "Well, that's better than nothing." So I took the full 12 weeks off with him, and fortunately found a woman to come into my house, because given the fact that I would travel, I needed a place where, in case he was sick, I would be able to still do my job, and was fortunate enough to be able to afford that. Second time, she was already in place, and so I only stayed home really about 2 months with my daughter.
Okay.
She's always resented it, I'm sure. But,
So did you feel that they were somewhat supportive, even though the maternity leave wasn't what you would have hoped it would have
right,
been?
and fortunately with the second child, I was able to get my boss said, "Look, I'm just going to pay you on the side anyway." So I got my full salary the entire time I was out with her.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you worked at Norfolk Southern until they relocated to Norfolk, and then did you relocate with them?
No, my husband then was a sole practitioner, and he had grown up in Roanoke and had a group of clients, and I thought it would be very hard at that point in his career to start anew, and so I decided that I would resign. Hated to leave the company. It was wonderful to me, and took a job with Shenandoah Life, which is home based there in Roanoke up on Brambleton Avenue. And they had one attorney who was nearing retirement age, and they were looking to backfill in behind him. So I joined as an attorney, and he retired in about 2.5 years, and I became general counsel, vice president and general counsel at Shenandoah Life.
Shenandoah Life. How long did you stay there?
I was there just 5 years.
Okay.
Because in that time, our divorce became final, and I remarried, and my husband, who was with Norfolk and Western, Norfolk Southern, was already located in Norfolk, and so I moved down there.
So what do you think your accomplishments were at Shenandoah Life?
Well, it was figuring out how to handle a much broader range of legal matters. We had some cases involving claims against the insurance policies that we were not exactly sure were valid. We had regulatory issues with the State Corporation Commission, and we had investment-related issues as well, because there was a large investment portfolio to backfill those policies. It was fun. I found myself getting into tax more than I had. I had taken the baby tax course at W&L, and my philosophy about tax was, you know, when you ran out of fingers in the regs, you better just take the last answer, because you were just, you know, that was going to be the answer, because you had no more fingers. Unfortunately, that was my full facility in tax. All fascinating questions. I really enjoyed it, and I was sorry to leave that because I was in charge of the department.
Right. Were there other women there?
Not in the law department, though. Just our staff was all female, and I hired a male attorney to be on my second in charge.
Okay. So you moved to Norfolk when?
In 1994.
Okay.
1994. So I was there from 1990 to the end of 1994.
And how old were your children?
Let's see. The children then were about. Let's see. They were more like 9 and 12. 9 and 12. Right.
Okay.
And my son went into private school there, Norfolk Academy, and my daughter spent 1 year in the local elementary school, and then she went out to Norfolk Academy as well. And there were a lot of railroad families that went to that school, so we joined the herd.
So tell me about your experience in Norfolk. What did you do when you got there?
I was a little adrift, I have to admit. I did not want to go into private practice. Boy, did I know that. I actually did a little bit of interviewing with some of the firms that my husband knew people in. And I said, I just don't think I can do that and raise these children, not the way I wanted to. And so I did some volunteer work, and I got engaged in a program called Kids Voting USA, which was founded by a newspaper editor out in Arizona to get children. It was based on a program he had seen in action in Costa Rica, where children actually went to the real polls and voted in their own mock elections. So it was not one of these things held in schools. They actually went to the polling place, and he thought that that would make all the difference. Of course, Costa Rica had a law requiring adults to vote, so they trained their children early in the voting process. So I said, well, that sounds like a really good thing to be involved in. So I started a chapter there in Norfolk, and we had schools in Virginia Beach and Norfolk and Chesapeake all participating. And
Nice.
it was a fun experience, and I worked out of the newspaper offices there at the Virginian Pilot. Well, in that process, I got to know the publisher, and when the Norfolk Foundation, the community foundation there, was looking for a associate executive director, there was it was a small town, and so the publisher of the newspaper contacted the head of the foundation and said, I may have a very good person for you.
Oh, wow.
And so I was able to secure that position at the Norfolk Foundation in 1990, and just loved the work. It was wonderful.
So tell me about it.
Well, they wanted someone with a law degree. The existing executive director was a former lawyer, had worked for the newspaper, as a matter of fact. And there was a fair amount of trust and estates knowledge that is helpful in working with the attorneys in town who would be advising clients about where to make bequests. And so that was really our bread and butter. Was a community foundation, of course, is built not by the assets of one philanthropist, but by the assets of many philanthropists in the community. And so we relied greatly on the T&E trade to bring those clients to us. And we had a great opportunity to cultivate them when we called them together. We decided to set up an advisory committee of these T&E lawyers, and they all would come, and we'd feed them lunch once a quarter, and got to know them well, and they got to know us well. And we grew our foundation from 100 million to 200 million in the 10 years that I was there.
That's amazing. So what kind of work did the foundation do?
Well, it was a repository for these assets, and we would take a percentage of those assets every year and pay them out into the community. And we had a very large scholarship program, because many donors are particularly interested in promoting education for those who might not otherwise be able to afford it. So we had a large scholarship program, plus we had a focus areas within the arts, within education, within I would say health and the environment, and so and social services. So there were lots of areas in which we could make grants. We had contacts with all of the nonprofits in town, and they could apply based on what time of year it was and which area was up for grants that particular quarter. We would receive those grant proposals. Our grant officers would work with those organizations to make sure that they were tailored well to our priorities and that they would be useful contributions. So we would pay out about $15 million a year into the community.
Wow.
About $1.5 million of that would go to the scholarships. And it was a really heartwarming thing to go to Old Dominion University's Philanthropist Day, where they would thank all of their donors. And you'd hear some of the stories from those who had received scholarships from the Norfolk Foundation.
Very nice, very nice. So I hear in a lot of what we're talking about is that a lot of what guided you was a work-life balance, especially when you have children. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, from the very start, as I started working at Dana Corporation in Toledo, Ohio, I said, you know, I have more to my life, and I want more to my life than working long hours that I had heard about in law firms. And as I came back from my first clerkship and talked to some of my classmates, I could see that they were really grinding it out in these summer clerkships. So, and my mother had always worked. She'd always taught, but that was 9 to 3:30. And so, 8 to 3:30. So that was my model. I admired her a great deal. She could have been a great lawyer, or she could have been a great CPA, but she just didn't have those opportunities. And she was always in my corner, encouraging me to do that. And I felt that if I could have a balanced life, I could raise children the way I wanted to raise them, if I was lucky enough to marry and have children. And so that's what I set myself up for. It was important to me to give as much of myself to them as I gave to the company. And I was very fortunate in that my employers respected that, both at the railroad and at Shenandoah Life, and really at the foundation. Fortunately, I became the CEO and I could set the standards.
Yes.
Yes, I'll never forget when my staff started coming in and saying, guess what, I'm pregnant. I'm going, oh, all right. Now I need to figure out how to handle this as equitably as I received.
So you, even though you were practicing at Norfolk Western and Shenandoah Life, you also were part of the legal community, not just with the women attorneys, but I believe you you got involved in golfing and some other things.
The bar there in Roanoke was very convivial, and one individual in particular stands out, and that was Dick Pattersall. He was just a big love. He really was, just a big bear. And he always held a golf tournament out at Hunting Hills Country Club in the summer, and he invited lawyers to sign up. It was called the Dick Pattersall Open. And we would show up out there at Hunting Hills, and we'd be put into foursomes. And I had played golf since I was a youngster. I had gotten, my father had gotten me a set early on because he had to learn how to play because he was a salesman. And I had summer jobs during college at the pro shop at his small country club. So the pro would take me out on quiet afternoons and we'd hit balls. And so I got a pretty decent game at that point. And so I would sign up, and so would Joan Gardner, who worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield as their general counsel there in Roanoke. And she was a finer golfer than I. But we were popular because many of the hills there, the holes at Hunting Hills are dog legs. And so she and I would hit it right down to the corner, and the guys could then, because on a captain's choice, you get to, the team chooses which ball they're going to play next. And so ours would be safe, and then they could hit theirs over the corner, over the dog leg, and be much further up the fairway if they got to the fairway. Most of the time they landed in the trees. But so we were just the bells of the ball when we got to the Dick Paddisol Open. It was a lot of fun. And there were outings. The bar outings were fun. It was just a really receptive community, and I had lots of friends throughout the bar. And the older gentlemen were cordial and welcoming. So I felt, maybe I'm just an optimist, but I never really felt any of the discrimination that I fear my comrades in the private practice realm felt. They might run into it in the courtroom, they might run into it in depositions, so I was really quite lucky.
And actually, that the woman that you worked for at the Boston law firm did run into that, did she not?
She did. She was never going to be a senior partner. One, she was Jewish. Two, she was female. And she was never going to make it to the senior level, and so she was called a junior partner. And here she was, 54 years old.
Wow.
But she just, it was so encouraging, and she was excited when I went off to law school. And for years afterwards, I got a card from her every Easter, a Happy Easter card.
So of all the people that you've worked with during your career, are there any that you particularly admire?
Any of the lawyers?
Mm-hmm. Or other?
Gosh, I would have to say, really, there in Roanoke, Diane was sort of our leader. She got there a year before I did, maybe two. And she really broke the barrier for our class. I call it our class of women that came into Roanoke. I admire her, and I also admire my a law school friend, Harriet Dorsey from Blacksburg. She was a year behind me, but a year older. And she went to Blacksburg because her husband was going to Virginia Tech when she graduated. And she encountered all sorts of issues with the bar down there. And she worked her way through it, and she developed a great practice with another law school classmate. And she had to work for everything she got. And I felt like my life was just so much easier. I admired senior members of the bar who had built practices. They were always very cordial to me. I didn't have to work for them.
That's true. That's true. Yes. Speaking of Judge Strickland, in the Roanoke Valley, there's only been one circuit court female named to the circuit court bench in the Roanoke Valley, and that was Judge Strickland, and she was one of two judges that were named to the General District Court bench, along with Judge Jacqueline Levy. And since then, there have been 4 women that were named to the Juvenile Court bench. But Judge Strickland retired in 2002, and there's not been another female named to the Circuit Court bench in the Roanoke Valley since that time. What are your thoughts on all of that and diversity on the bench and in the bar?
Well, I think, unfortunately, that the judgeships are sort of considered to be retirement positions for senior members of the bar. And I fear that the women don't get those opportunities until they're fairly senior, and then there's competition for those positions, and they're not being promoted by the bar associations who vote on whom they'd like the legislators to recommend. So I think it's sort of a catch-22. If you don't have the numbers, you don't have the prestige, you don't have the support with the legislature, and that makes it hard for women. It's not fair. They ought to be considered. I think in most cases the women are smarter than the men. They always work harder because they have to work harder. And I've been on the outside looking in, except with respect to my friend Harriet Dorsey, who has been a substitute judge in the J&D, was for years, but the times that she ran for the nomination to the circuit court, she was never chosen.
So what are your thoughts about that? For the first time since the Roanoke Bar Association was incorporated in 1925, they now have a full female board and slate of officers. Does that surprise you?
Oh, it's amazing. I think it's wonderful. But no, it doesn't surprise me, because women have to get organized. They have domestic responsibilities, they have professional responsibilities, and you have to get organized. One little story. I once in the house there in Norfolk lost my daytimer. I was writing everything down before I had a phone. And I went crazy. And my children, who were, 13 and 10, and trying to get ready for school, said, "Oh my God, we got to find this. We got to find this." And so they searched the house with me, and we found it in my daughter's bedroom, where I'd been reading her a story, and I'd lost it in the covers. Well, that just, you lived your life by that book because you had so much to do. And women have always wanted to tidy their nest, if you will. And that's, maybe, I don't know whether that's genetic, what it is, but we just want to make our communities better. And so many men do as well. But the women take on those extra jobs because those communities are important to them and their families.
So are there other life accomplishments that you want to talk about?
Oh, gosh.
I'm thinking about the Virginia Kindergarten Readiness Program.
Oh, goodness, yes. Well, for 20 years, I worked on that. At the foundation, when I first started and became executive director and then the CEO, I was looking for a signature project. And so I sent my great grants director out into the community to sort of test what she thought might be an appropriate focus area for us. And she came up with early childhood education. She'd been to a great early learning center there in Norfolk, and she said, this might be something we should introduce our board to. So we had one woman. We had 6 men and 1 woman on our board. And we went to the child care center, and they had a kiva, a common room, where all the children played at one point. And up above was their meeting room with a big glass window looking down into the kiva. And we had our board meeting up there. We always took our board off-site into the community, just so we could be seen and people didn't think that we were some deep, dark, mysterious organization. It started when I started. And I can remember seeing the senior lawyer at Wilcox Savage and Josh Darden, the senior businessman in the community, looking down through that window to those children and said, "Gosh, this is really important that they've got a place to be." And boom, that was it. They all decided. She went around, my grants director went around and talked to each of the board members individually, and they all said, "We've got to do something about quality early childhood education." So we got it started there in the Norfolk area. We got to the point where at a large business association meeting, one of the bank presidents got up and said, "Well, a child's brain is 90% formed by the time they're 5 years old." I said, "We've done it. We've got them. They know it's important." So then we started working with the child care centers to develop a quality rating system so that parents would know which organizations were quality. And then we expanded the effort to the state of Virginia, and we became the Elevate Early Education Organization, E3, that was primarily an advocacy organization to convince the legislators in Richmond that it was important to fund early childhood education, and starting and not limiting it just to the low-income population. It needed to be statewide, and it needed to be social-economically equal. And we did some assessments around the state and discovered that based on 4 important criteria, such as literacy, math, social skills, and self-regulation, that 42% of our children were not ready for kindergarten. Oh. That was impressive to the state legislature. We got a JLARC study done. They recommended that the state invested in it. And it took us 10 years to get to that point. And in that process, we said, we need to give the legislators something they can touch and feel. And so we started a school in Norfolk, right at the edge of our downtown mostly black neighborhood. But it was close to downtown. It was on the side of a Y. We had a philanthropist who helped us buy the land, build the school, and endow it, Jane Batten. And she was a strong supporter of early childhood education, still on the board. She's been on the board for 12 years now. And the goal was to help our legislators see what children can do from all income levels, and it's an all income level school. We reserve about a third for low income, a third for middle income, and we have a third high income. And the quality is such that we're oversubscribed on the high income. There are too many people who want to be in on that. And we developed a curriculum under the auspices of UVA, the Curry School of Education, and it's a great curriculum which is now recommended by the state for use in early learning centers all over the state. We developed the assessment tool, which is called the Virginia Kindergarten Readiness Project, that is an assessment given at the first 6 weeks of kindergarten and then at the end. And what we assess are those four indicia: the literacy, the numeracy, the social skills, and the executive function, which is self-regulation. And we do it at the end, and we see how the kindergarten teachers are doing any remediation for the children who've come in with deficits. And unfortunately, due to COVID, we're back up into the 42nd percentile of children not ready.
Wow.
But we have proven that our curriculum works and that the VKRP works, and that now is a required assessment in all public schools in Virginia, is the initial kindergarten assessment, so that teachers know what they're working with and they are given the skills through the UVA curriculum to do something about it.
Wow.
So I was chair for the last 2 years, and I just rolled off this year, but I'm passionate about that.
Very wonderful. So you're 50 years plus from graduation from W&L?
Not quite. I graduated in 75, so we're going back in 2 years.
Okay.
Yes.
But from your admission in 72?
Oh, yes. True.
Yes.
True.
So have you had any reunion or meetups with your classmates?
Oh, gosh. Well, not really, except for our regular reunions.
Okay.
Unfortunately, one is deceased. One never came back. Another one rarely comes back. Usually, it's just the guys and I.
Okay. Okay.
And Sally Wyatt, who was always in Lexington. She was our classmate through that time as she was getting her position there in the law library. But it was a very close class, and I was honored to receive at the last reunion a special award from the school. It's just award given to a graduate from a class reunion, and I can't remember exactly the name of it. I was very pleased to receive it. I think it's alumna of the year, alumnus of the year.
Nice.
And it was, but you know, the guys were so cute. They came down the steps with a big bouquet for me. It was
Nice.
very, very sweet.
So you truly have been a trailblazer, not only for women in the law in Virginia, and in particular in the Roanoke Valley, but also for the betterment of women in general. What are your observations of the progress or lack thereof of equality of women attorneys in Virginia and elsewhere, and women on the bench?
Well, I would say that I don't have really close experience with women who have been out there practicing and appearing before the courts. And so I look at it from afar, and I'm amazed at the numbers of women going into law school. W&L has, I think, a few more women than it has men at this point.
Wow.
And so there's been great change over that time. And as the women have flooded the ranks of attorneys, you know, it's forced the change. And I think as more women ascend the bench, it gets to be a very level playing field. I can only hope it will be there.
Do you have any message you want to give women just coming into the practice of law today?
Well, I guess you identified the theme, which was to find a practice that would permit me to raise a family. And I am thankful I had the opportunities to do in-house work. One, the hours were great. Two, the benefits were great. The pension is great. And what I find is that I think women need to understand themselves in making those career choices. And if I would have any advice at all, I'd say look in your heart and find what you value in life. And yes, you may not be married now coming out of law school, but you're probably open to it. And if you are, and you're open to having children, you need to think about how you're going to achieve a balanced work-life arrangement. And so my advice would be, look at all the opportunities. In-house is one, government's another, and think before you leave.
So what would you like your legacy to be?
Well, I would say, first of all, making a happy home for my husband, raising happy, healthy children, enjoying my grandchildren, and I think leaving this state a little bit better for having worked in the early childhood arena.
Angelica, thank you for participating in the Virginia Women Attorneys Association Oral History Project. I really enjoyed the interview and I appreciate you participating.
Oh, this has been a great fun, great treat for me. Thank you so much, and I appreciate the honor.